The late summer sun bore down on Fort Bragg, the heat clinging to the fatigues of every soldier on the tarmac. Sergeant Maya Reeves stood with her arms crossed, scanning the line of recruits unloading from the Black Hawk. Dust swirled around their boots, a gritty welcome to the Carolina humidity. This assignment wasn't what she had planned, not after 3 tours overseas and nearly a decade in Special Forces. But Command had other ideas. "They look even younger this time," remarked Captain Robert Mason, stepping up beside her. His southern drawl was subtle but noticeable. They'd trained together years ago in Texas, back when Maya still had doubts about herself. "We don't have time for slow learners," she replied. Intelligence reports suggested the nearby training grounds could become more than theoretical exercises. The region had seen recent attempts at base infiltration. These kids needed to grow up fast. Maya's attention caught on one of the newcomers, a tall, broad-shouldered man with too much swagger for someone still green. James Hoffman. She had read his file twice. Former college quarterback out of Nebraska, top of his class in basic, strong aptitude for leadership, but flagged for insubordination. "That one's going to be trouble," Mason muttered. "Let's see what kind of trouble," Maya answered, eyes still fixed on Hoffman. She wasn't intimidated. But she knew the type. Men who confused volume with authority, who had never taken orders from someone like her. Her size, her gender, her calm, people mistook them for softness. The following morning, Maya led the recruits through their first exercise, a mock village clearing. They used simulation rounds, harmless if handled properly, dangerous if not. Maya demonstrated a textbook breach technique, one she'd used during an op in Syria. "This isn't Call of Duty," she said. "This is muscle memory that keeps you and your team breathing. You flinch, they die. You freeze, they die." Most recruits absorbed her words. Hoffman didn't. He whispered something to the guy next to him and smirked. Maya turned. "Something funny, Private Hoffman?" "No, ma'am," he replied with that smug grin. "Good," she said, "because the technique I just showed saved an entire school of kids outside Mosul. I'd hate to think you knew better." She paired with Hoffman for the next demonstration. The room they entered was cleared of hazards, but the silence hung heavy. As Maya advanced, she noticed it, a subtle shift in his stance, the angle of his rifle. He turned and raised it, directly at her, finger near the trigger, inches from her forehead. "Bang," he whispered, eyes cold. "Guess you're dead, Sergeant." The recruits froze. Maya didn't flinch. She saw not just arrogance, but ignorance, dangerous, untested ignorance, the kind that got people killed. "Interesting choice, Private," she said softly. What happened next unfolded so quickly no one agreed on the sequence. Maya's arm snapped up, knocking his rifle away. She stepped in, struck his chest, swept his leg. Hoffman hit the ground hard. Her boot pressed gently against his throat. She didn't raise her voice. "In real combat, you'd be dead, and your decision would have endangered your entire unit." Captain Mason appeared in the doorway, his face hard. "My office, now. Both of you." They walked across the base in silence. Hoffman's cocky air had cracked, but not shattered. Inside, Mason didn't wait. "Private, you're lucky this didn't end your career. But you're also about to get your first real assignment. A credible threat's developing outside Jackson County. Sergeant Reeves is leading a small team to extract friendly assets. You're going with her. You follow every order, or I'll personally sign your court-martial." Maya didn't look at Hoffman. She just said, "We roll in 1 hour, pack light." As she left the office, the air shifted. It was no longer about teaching tactics. It was about survival. And soon James Hoffman would learn the hard way what it meant to cross someone who had survived what he couldn't even imagine. The sun had barely crested the trees as the Humvee rumbled down a dirt road carved through dense pine. Maya sat in the front seat, eyes locked on the tree line. Beside her, Private Hoffman fidgeted with his gear. The rest of the team, 4 seasoned soldiers and 1 medic, rode in tense silence. The mission was clear: extract 2 local informants and their families from a remote Appalachian hollow. But the real objective, at least in Maya's mind, was something else entirely. Hoffman needed to learn the difference between bravado and leadership, between recklessness and responsibility. They dismounted a half-mile from the target site. Maya gave silent hand signals, and the team broke into formation. She took point, stepping lightly over gnarled roots and damp leaves. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Not a bird chirped. Maya's gut tightened. "Something's wrong," she whispered into her comms. "Stay sharp." The cabin came into view, a weathered structure tucked against a slope. A faint wisp of smoke rose from the chimney. No movement. Maya crouched, signaling for Hoffman and another soldier to flank. They approached from opposite sides. As Maya crept toward the front porch, the door swung open. A child stood there, barefoot, wide-eyed, maybe 6 years old. "We're friends," Maya said softly, lowering her rifle. "Where's your mom and dad?" The child pointed to the barn. That's when the first shot rang out. Wood splintered by Maya's head. She dove left, shouting, "Ambush! South tree line!" Gunfire erupted from the shadows. Hoffman, caught in the open, hit the ground hard and crawled for cover behind a fallen log. The other team members returned fire. Maya rolled behind the well, reloaded and scanned for the shooter. She saw him, a figure in tactical gear, perched high with a scoped rifle. A professional. "Sniper, second floor of the red barn," she called. Hoffman was closest. "Private, that's your flank. Get eyes on him and suppress." He hesitated. Just for a second, then popped up, rifle steady, firing in short bursts. The sniper shifted, giving Maya the opening she needed. She sprinted to a better angle and fired. The figure dropped. "Move!" Maya barked. They rushed the barn. Inside, the informants, 2 men and their wives, were bound, terrified. Maya cut them loose. "We're here to get you out. We've got a vehicle half a click north. Can you walk?" One woman nodded. The other clutched her child's hand tightly. Outside, the woods echoed with more movement. Reinforcements. Maya's team was outnumbered. "Change of plan," she said. "Hoffman, you take lead with the civilians. Get them to the vehicle. I'll hold rear." "You sure?" he asked, voice lower now, the edge of sarcasm gone. "Go, now." They moved in staggered formation, weaving through the woods as bullets cracked past them. Maya fired in bursts, covering their retreat. She took a grazing hit to the shoulder but stayed upright. Blood stained her sleeve, but she kept moving. At the extraction point, the Humvee came into view. Hoffman shouted over the gunfire, "Move! Move! Get in!" He helped the families into the vehicle, then turned to see Maya stumbling through the brush, still firing. He ran to her, grabbed her good arm, and hauled her the last few feet. Inside the vehicle, engines roared. The team pulled away as gunmen broke from the tree line too late. Maya leaned back, breathing hard, her wound beginning to throb. Hoffman looked over, eyes wider than before. "You took a hit. Not the first, won't be the last. You didn't leave me." Maya turned, her gaze sharp. "And you didn't freeze. That's a start." As the Humvee climbed the ridge, the sun broke fully over the mountain, casting light on the road ahead. But shadows still clung to what they left behind. The medic worked silently in the back of the Humvee, wrapping gauze around Maya's shoulder. She winced but said nothing. Outside the window, the hills rolled by in fading shades of green. Hoffman sat across from her, his rifle laid flat across his knees, eyes downcast. "The shot went clean through," the medic said. "You'll be fine, but you'll need rest." Maya shook her head. "There's no rest out here. Not yet." The team returned to Fort Bragg late that evening. The base was quieter than usual, the air thick with humidity and the unspoken tension that always followed close calls. Maya climbed out first, ignoring the ache in her shoulder, and walked straight toward the debriefing tent. Hoffman followed a few paces behind, saying nothing. Inside, Captain Mason waited, arms folded, jaw tight. "Report." Maya gave a clear, efficient rundown. Hostile contact confirmed, informant secured, civilian casualties avoided. Mason nodded once, then turned to Hoffman. "Your version?" Hoffman hesitated. "We were outnumbered. The sergeant held the line so the rest of us could get the civilians out. She took a round but didn't flinch. If she hadn't been there, I don't think any of us would have made it." There was no sarcasm, no swagger, just a raw, humbled tone. Mason leaned back. "Noted. Both of you are off rotation for 72 hours. Medical checks, then rest. Dismissed." Back in the barracks, Maya sat at the edge of her cot, finally letting the fatigue sink in. The hum of the base generator outside her window was oddly soothing. She stared at her boots, still muddy from the woods. A knock at the open door. Permission to enter, Sergeant? She looked up. Hoffman stood there, his shirt wrinkled, eyes uncertain. Come in, Private. He stepped inside, but didn't sit. I wanted to say what I did during that first training exercise, pointing the rifle at you, that was out of line. I thought I was proving something. I wasn't. I was just trying to look like I belonged. Maya nodded slowly. You ever look down the barrel of a loaded gun pointed at your own head, Hoffman? He swallowed. No, I have, twice. Once in Syria, once in Kandahar. You don't forget the feeling. That moment you're sure it's over. What you did, training or not, wasn't a joke. That kind of arrogance, it gets people killed. He didn't argue, just stood there taking it. But today, she continued, you listened. You moved when I told you. You pulled me out. That's something. He looked relieved, but not proud. I'm trying to learn. Good, then keep showing me, not with words, with actions. He nodded and turned to leave. Just before stepping out, he paused. You ever think I'll be ready for something more? Like special forces? Maya considered. Ask me again after 10 more missions like that. And don't forget today, just because you made it back. The real lesson is what you do tomorrow. That night, thunder rolled over the base, low and distant. Rain began to fall in scattered drops on the tin roofs. Maya lay awake, the ache in her shoulder a steady reminder of the day. She wasn't sure if Hoffman was going to make it, but something had changed. And sometimes the smallest shift could mean the difference between a soldier and a liability. Outside in the darkness, the storm built slowly, like something waiting to break. The storm didn't let up for 2 days. Rain pooled in the training fields, turning dirt into deep patches of mud. Morning drills were postponed, and the recruits found shelter in the hangars, working on weapons maintenance and combat simulations. Maya sat in the observation room above the range, her shoulders still stiff beneath the sling, watching the recruits cycle through virtual combat scenarios on the monitors. Her eyes kept drifting back to Hoffman's screen. He moved through the simulation more deliberately now, sweeping corners, checking angles, calling out imaginary enemies with quiet focus. Gone was the overconfidence. In its place, there was something that looked almost like caution. Captain Mason entered, shaking off rain from his poncho. Thought you'd be getting some rest. Watching the next mission, Maya replied. He took the chair beside her, following her gaze to the screen. You think he's worth it? Ask me again in 6 months, she said, but he's not the same man who got off that chopper. Mason leaned back, his voice low. Command wants you back into the field. Forward assignment, small team recon in eastern Syria. Could be months. High risk, low visibility. Maya didn't answer right away. Her hand flexed slightly around the stress ball in her lap. Her shoulder throbbed in rhythm with the storm. And they want you to take a recruit, Mason added. Someone you can mold. She glanced at him. They suggested Hoffman. He shrugged. Or you could say no. There are other options. Maya looked back at the screen. Hoffman's avatar was covering a simulated hostage as AI combatants closed in. I'll decide by Friday, she said. Down in the hangar, Hoffman exited the sim pod, sweat beading at his hairline. Another recruit slapped him on the back. He didn't smile, just nodded, checked his weapon settings, and reset the simulation. Later that evening, Maya walked alone beneath the awning outside the barracks. Rain drummed softly on the metal. She lit a cigarette, her first in over a year, and took a long drag. Not because she needed the nicotine, but because something about that storm reminded her of a mission in Kandahar, the one where she lost 2 of her team, the one she still dreamed about. Footsteps behind her. Didn't peg you for a smoker, Hoffman said, stopping a few feet away. I'm not, she replied, except when I'm remembering. He nodded, unsure what to say. The rain made it easier to stand in silence. I asked Captain Mason about deployment, he said finally. He said there's a recon team forming. Maya looked at him. And? I want in. I know I'm not where I need to be yet, but I will be. If you say I'm not ready, I'll accept that. But if you think there's a chance, I'll earn it. She studied him. No bluster, no bravado, just words that cost him something to say. She flicked the cigarette into a puddle. Show up at 0500 tomorrow. We'll run a qualifying circuit. Just you and me. No shortcuts, no excuses. He gave a small nod. Yes, Sergeant. Bring rain gear, she added. I don't cancel for weather. As he walked off, Maya stayed under the awning a moment longer, watching the rain trace lines down the concrete. The boy was changing, and somewhere in that shift, a soldier might just be forming. She pulled her hood over her head and stepped out into the storm. Dawn broke pale and cold. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still soaked, steam rising off the soaked asphalt of the training yard. Maya stood at the edge of the course, stopwatch in hand. She wore a black windbreaker, boots still damp from yesterday's storm. Hoffman jogged up, dressed in full gear, breath visible in the morning air. You're late, Maya said. It was 4:59. Ma'am, it's 0530 seconds. And in the field, 30 seconds can mean 3 funerals. Get moving. The qualifying course wound through the outer perimeter of the base, 5 miles of punishing terrain. Weighted pack, full combat gear, weapons secured. There were walls to scale, trenches to crawl, and memory drills at each checkpoint. Maya followed on foot, keeping distance but never losing sight. At mile 2, Hoffman stumbled, crossing a shallow ditch slick with mud. He cursed under his breath, then pushed harder. His breathing was ragged, but he didn't slow. By the final checkpoint, his hands were shaking from the cold. He had to recall a 9-digit grid coordinate Maya had barked at him an hour earlier. He got 7 digits right. Close, Maya said flatly. Not close enough. He nodded, swallowing hard. Again. She looked at him, surprised. Excuse me? I want to run it again. I need to get it right. For the first time, a flicker of something lit in her chest. Not pride yet, but maybe something like belief. Drop your pack. 10-minute breather. Then we go again. They finished just before the sun rose over the eastern treetops. By then, Hoffman's arms were trembling. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat. But he remembered the full coordinate string the second time. Report to medical, Maya said. They'll check your vitals. If they clear you, you're on my team. He didn't smile, just nodded and limped toward the infirmary. Later that afternoon, Maya sat in Captain Mason's office. Her shoulder was unwrapped now, scar tissue still raw but healing. She dropped a printed report on his desk. Hoffman's ready, not perfect, but trainable. He'll listen. Mason raised an eyebrow. That's a turnaround. I made him run the course twice. He didn't quit. Then he's yours. Orders came in this morning. Your wheels up in 72 hours. Syria, small recon team. Advanced contact with Kurdish intelligence. Limited support. High risk. Maya leaned back. Her eyes didn't waver. Put me down. I'll assemble the team. As she walked out, Mason called after her. You sure about him? She paused in the doorway. No, but I'm sure about me. That evening, the barracks buzzed with rumors. Deployments always stirred nerves. Some recruits packed their bags with practiced calm. Others whispered about Syria like it was a death sentence. Hoffman sat on his bunk, methodically cleaning his rifle. His hands were steady now, focused. A folded paper sat on the locker beside him, Maya's handwritten checklist for deployment prep. Every line underlined, every detail tested. He didn't notice Maya watching from the hallway for a moment before she turned away. She knew now, the boy who had once aimed a training rifle at her skull was gone, and the man who remained was about to learn what it meant to carry real weight. Not just in gear, but in responsibility, in silence, in survival. The next mission would strip them all to their core, and only the ones who had learned how to lose themselves in service to others would come back whole. 48 hours later, the team boarded a military transport plane under cover of darkness. No fanfare, no send-off. Just 6 soldiers and a duffel of classified orders. Maya sat near the rear of the plane, her eyes closed, head resting lightly against the cold metal bulkhead. Hoffman sat across from her, glancing down at his boots, then at the silent team around him. Staff Sergeant Ray Cole, a seasoned communications expert from Michigan, gave him a subtle nod. Beside him, Corporal Elena Vega ran through gear checks with a calm, almost ritual rhythm. Their medic, Thomas Doc Branley, was reading a weathered copy of Catch-22, the spine frayed, corners torn. The remaining 2, Specialist June Park and Sniper Jessica Rowe, barely spoke at all. This was no training squad. These were operators. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, Maya opened her eyes. First insertions near Hasaka, We'll land at a Kurdish forward post, then proceed overland. 72-hour window to recon 3 target grids. Our job is eyes, not action. If contact happens, it'll be fast and ugly. Hoffman nodded, tension in his jaw. Maya added, "You're not here because you're ready. You're here because you need to learn, and you learn fastest when failure isn't an option." Hours later, they landed on a gravel airstrip under dim red lights. Heat poured off the tarmac like breath from the earth itself. The Kurdish liaison, a wiry man named Daoud, greeted them in fluent English. "We move fast, this way." The next day, they traversed the outskirts of a collapsed village, now silent but for the hum of distant drones. The air carried a heavy scent, sand, fuel, and something older. Burnt brick, perhaps. A memory of fire. Maya moved with purpose, checking angles, scanning windows. She raised her fist. The team halted. A faint clicking sound came from beneath a half-buried doorframe. "IED," she signaled back. Park moved in carefully, tools already in hand. Hoffman watched, breath held. Maya leaned in. "Tripwire, crude but deadly. Watch this." Park worked quickly, sweat dripping from his brow. The device was disarmed in under 90 seconds. "You're going to see a lot of that out here," Maya said, "but the one that gets you is the one you don't notice." They resumed the sweep. At the second grid, Rotu took position on a crumbled rooftop, her scope sweeping the horizon. She radioed, "Movement, North Ridge, 4 figures, no weapons visible." Maya responded, "Stand down, watch only." The figures passed like shadows, locals or scouts, impossible to tell. Maya held the team in place for a long moment. Sometimes you don't shoot, you just see. That's harder. That night, they camped under the open sky, the stars brutal in their clarity. Hoffman sat alone, still wired, hands restless. Maya joined him, holding a tin mug of bitter tea. "You think too much out here and the silence will eat you alive," she said. He looked at her. "I keep wondering what the right call is. Every corner could be something or nothing. That's the job. You make the call, you live with it, or you die with it." She stood. "Get some rest, Private. Tomorrow we hit grid 3. That one's not empty." Hoffman lay back on his pack, eyes on the stars, the weight of the mission pressing down. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew he'd find out soon enough. Because the lesson wasn't coming, it was already here. By dawn, the desert wind had changed. It carried the sharp, metallic scent of sand stirred by distant movement. Grid 3 sat near the ruins of an abandoned textile mill, its skeletal structure rising like a ghost from the earth. The team advanced slowly, boots crunching over broken rock and spent shell casings half buried in the dust. Maya raised her hand, signaling a halt. She studied the layout. High windows, crumbling walls, collapsed floors, too many blind spots. "We approach from the east," she said. "Cole, set relay here. Rowe, find height. Park, Hoffman, you're with me." They moved in formation, tension strung tight across each step. As they reached the edge of the compound, Maya's radio crackled. "Rowe here. Got eyes on 3 armed men inside. Looks like Russian pattern gear. Could be mercs." "Copy," Maya said. She turned to Hoffman. "No engagement unless fired upon. You stay behind me." Inside, the mill was all echo and shadow. Shafts of light cut through holes in the ceiling. Old machinery stood frozen in decay. They advanced room by room, sweeping methodically. In one chamber, they found a makeshift command post. Maps, satellite phones, rations. "They were here recently," Park muttered. Then came the shot. A single crack split the air. Park dropped hard, a red bloom spreading from his side. "Sniper!" Maya yelled, dragging him behind a fallen beam. Hoffman returned fire instinctively, eyes scanning the far windows. "Second floor, northeast corner," Rowe called from her perch. "Suppressive fire now," Maya barked. Hoffman obeyed without hesitation, bullets slamming into the brick near the shooter's nest. Maya flanked left, climbed a rusted stairwell, and breached the upper room. The shooter, a lean man in desert fatigues, spun toward her too late. 2 rounds. Silence. She returned moments later, eyes hard. "Snipers down. Park stable, but we need evac." Cole radioed command, requesting medevac at grid 3. 1 wounded, possible intel recovery. As they secured the site, Maya examined the maps left behind. They weren't just tracking local movements. They were coordinating them. Routes, supply chains, even names. One caught her eye, Lieutenant Jamel al-Khatib. She went still. That name hadn't crossed her path since Mosul. He was presumed dead, a ghost. And now he was back on Isbordabad. That night they made camp inside the ruins. Park was stable but pale, IV bag rigged to a pipe. The rest of the team took turns on watch. Hoffman sat across from Maya, polishing his rifle by lantern light. "You move fast," she said. "You taught me how." She sipped from a canteen. "It's not always about speed. It's about clarity. You had it today." He looked at her, his voice low. "Back at Fort Bragg, when I pointed that rifle at you, I didn't understand what it meant. Not really, but after today, after watching Park bleed out while we're pinned down, I get it. That moment could have been real. Could have gone bad fast." Maya nodded. "That's the thing about responsibility, Hoffman. It doesn't care if you're ready. It just shows up." Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows. The desert never slept, and neither did those who'd chosen this path. In the distance, a helicopter's low thrum began to rise, a signal of extraction. But for Maya and for Hoffman, this mission had already carved something deeper into both of them. Not a scar, not yet, but the start of one. The medevac arrived just after midnight, its blades kicking up clouds of sand and old papers from the mill's floor. Park was loaded onto the burr with care, Doc Branley riding alongside him. As the helicopter lifted into the night, Maya stood watching until the lights faded completely. "We regroup at the fallback site," she said to the team. "Move light, stay quiet. If they know we were here, they'll be looking." They hiked north under moonlight, boots crunching softly against gravel and shattered glass. After 2 hours, they reached an abandoned fuel depot buried into a shallow canyon. It was a place Maya had used before, off the books, never logged in official records. A quiet shadow. Inside, the space was cramped and smelled of rust, but it was dry and hidden. Cole set up comms while Rowe took watch from a ridgeline. Hoffman helped unpack rations. He said little, but his body moved with focused purpose. There was no more fidgeting, no more checking over his shoulder. Later, around a battery lamp, Maya unrolled the maps they had taken from the mill. She pointed at the markings again. "This isn't just local insurgents. These routes, they're supply corridors. This one runs straight from the Turkish border into Raqqa. And this name, Al-Khatib." Cole leaned in. "I thought he was dead." "So did I," Maya said. "But if he's alive, he's pulling strings. And we just walked into one of his nests." A long silence fell. "So what now?" Hoffman asked. "Now we intercept one of these convoys," Maya said. "We confirm he's involved. Then we disappear before anyone realizes we were ever here." The next morning they moved before first light, traveling east toward a canyon marked as a crossing point. The terrain was harsh, jagged stone and fine sand that shifted underfoot. By midday, they found high ground above a ravine where old tires marked a dirt path carved by smugglers and traders. Rowe spotted movement first. 3 vehicles, trucks, no flags, armed guards in the rear beds. "Hold fire," Maya whispered. She peered through binoculars, tracking every face. In the second truck sat a man wearing a black scarf and desert jacket. His face was older now, scar along his jaw, but she recognized him instantly. "Al-Khatib." "Target confirmed," she said into comms. "Repeat, Al-Khatib confirmed alive." She snapped photos silently, evidence for command. But as she pulled back, something caught her eye, a glint on the rocks below. A scope. "Sniper, get down!" she shouted. The first shot cracked past her ear. The team scattered behind cover as dust exploded in the air. Cole returned fire while Rowe repositioned for a flank. Maya and Hoffman crawled behind a boulder, pinned. "They knew we'd be here," Hoffman muttered. "Or someone tipped them," Maya replied grimly. Rowe's voice broke in over the comms. "I've got the sniper. Give me 10 seconds. Maya nodded, then silence. 1 shot. Then Rowe's voice again. "Clear." The convoy below was already retreating, trucks speeding into the canyon's edge. Maya stood, brushing sand from her face. "We don't pursue. We've got what we came for. We get out, we report it, and command decides the next move." As they packed up, Hoffman turned to her. "You said earlier the field doesn't care if you're ready." "I remember." He looked out over the canyon where the last truck's dust trail had faded. I think I'm finally starting to understand what that means. Maya gave him a long, steady look. Good, because understanding is what separates the ones who make it from the ones who don't. They exfiltrated through a dry riverbed, silent and tense. Every shadow looked like a rifle, every echo a trap. By the time they reached the Kurdish outpost, the sun was high and brutal, baking their gear in their skin. Maya handed off the intel packet without ceremony. Satellite uplink it straight to Langley, she told the local officer. Don't wait. They need to see that face. Inside the temporary command tent, she washed her hands in silence, watching red dust swirl down the cracked basin. Behind her, Hoffman hovered near the entrance, hesitant. You got something to say? She asked without turning. I watched you in that canyon. You didn't hesitate. Not once. I'm in under fire. She dried her hands, faced him. You think bravery means not hesitating? Doesn't it? She shook her head. Hesitation's human. What matters is what you do next. I hesitated a second before my first kill, and I've hesitated before every mission since. But I do it anyway. That's the difference. That night, they slept in shifts. The team camped beneath the stars once again. Cole passed a flask around, quiet laughter breaking through the tension like the first cracks in old ice. Maya sat apart, her rifle across her knees. The desert stretched quiet around them. A different quiet than before. This one wasn't empty. It was earned. Hoffman joined her, holding 2 mugs of instant coffee. He offered one. She accepted. You think we'll go after Al-Khatib again? He asked. If we're lucky. No, she replied. He raised an eyebrow. Because if we go after him, it means another town burns. More bodies drop. We're good at what we do, Hoffman. But good doesn't mean easy. He was silent a while, then said, You were right about the weight. It's not the gear. It's the stuff you carry when no one's looking. Maya studied him, really studied him. The cocky boy from Bragg was gone. In his place sat a soldier. Still green, still learning, but different. You did well out there, she said. He blinked. Didn't expect to hear that from you. Don't expect praise. Just recognize growth. In the morning, a C-130 would take them back. The mission was over. But Hoffman knew deep down that something had changed forever. Back in the States, he'd walk the same ground, see the same streets, but he would no longer be the same man who'd once raised a training rifle to prove a point. That man was gone. And in his place was someone who understood, truly understood, why you never take your team for granted, and why you never, ever cross a veteran who's already buried friends for less. The stars above seemed brighter than before, or maybe it was just that finally he could see them clearly. The transport plane touched down at Fort Bragg in the dead of night. No flags, no bands, no ceremony. Just boots on tarmac and the low growl of diesel engines in the distance. The air was thick with pine and humidity, familiar and disorienting all at once. Maya stepped off first, her movements precise despite the exhaustion. Hoffman followed, the weight of his ruck oddly lighter now, though nothing in him felt light. Captain Mason met them near the hangar. No handshake, no welcome back. Just a quiet nod and a curt debrief at 0800. Dismissed. In the barracks, Hoffman stood under the shower longer than he meant to, letting the water pound against his neck. He didn't think about the firefight. He thought about Park bleeding out beside rusted machinery, about Maya's steady voice in the middle of chaos, about the way the canyon dust stuck to everything, gear, skin, memory. By morning, he was in Mason's office, boots polished, uniform crisp, eyes steady. You saw combat, Mason said, reading the report. Handled yourself. Took orders. Didn't freeze. No, sir. You want special forces selection? Yes, sir. Mason set the papers down. Reeves signed off on your application. That doesn't happen often. Hoffman tried not to let the shock show. She did. She did. She said, and I quote, he still has things to learn, but now he knows he does. A pause. You'll report to pre-selection training the next month. Until then, you're staying here. Maya's training another unit. You're her second. Hoffman stood. Understood. Back on the training field, the rhythm was the same. Boots in mud, drills barked out across open spaces. But Maya noticed the shift. Hoffman watched the recruits the way she used to, quietly assessing, calculating who might break, who might rise. That afternoon, they ran a simulation. Room clearing, live coordination with blanks and sensors. Hoffman moved with confidence, but not ego. He directed his unit with clarity, covering his corners, checking every field. When the last hostage was secured and the alarm silenced, Maya approached. "Solid work," she said. "They were better than we were," he replied, nodding toward the recruits. "Or maybe just faster." She smirked. "Speed's easy. Discipline takes longer." That evening, she found him at the range shooting alone. "You planning to sleep tonight or just scare the hell out of the paper targets?" she asked. He lowered the rifle. Hard to wind down. "It'll come, then it'll leave again. That's the cycle." "Did it ever stop for you?" She hesitated, then said, "Only once, and it didn't last." They stood in silence for a while, the night air cool around them. "You've got something most soldiers don't figure out until it's too late," she said. "You learned the hard way, but you learned." He looked at her, really looked. "Thanks for not giving up on me." Maya shook her head. "You think this was about you? I didn't do it for you, Hoffman. I did it because someday you'll be the one not giving up on someone else. And that's how we keep each other alive." A gust of wind kicked up dust across the range. Lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere nearby, cicadas had started to sing. Neither of them said anything else. There was nothing left to prove. Only the work ahead, and the memory of what it took to get here. The following weeks passed in a rhythm that felt both punishing and familiar. Morning started before sunrise. Drills, field exercises, late-night debriefs. Maya pushed the recruits harder than most instructors dared, and Hoffman matched her pace every step of the way. The new class wasn't like the last. Younger, rowdier, more eager than ready. They made mistakes, but none repeated. Not under Maya's watch. One afternoon during a heat wave that sent 2 recruits to the medic, Maya called a halt under the covered range. "Everyone hydrate, 10 minutes. Don't wander." As the recruits sprawled out in the shade, Hoffman walked over holding a clipboard. "Number 6 and 9, their timing's off clearing corners. We can run the simulation again tonight." Maya nodded. "Add number 3. She's too slow on reload." He paused. "You saw that from the tower?" "I see everything. That's the job." Later that night, the base quieted. Hoffman found himself in the common room alone, flipping through the after-action reports from the Syria op. Not officially, but someone had slipped him a copy. Probably Cole. The names felt heavier now. Park, Branley, Rowe. The people who'd watched him become something else. Not because they'd taught him, but because they'd trusted him not to get them killed. He didn't hear Maya enter until she stood behind him. "You're not going to find what you're looking for in those." "What am I looking for?" "Validation, meaning, closure. We don't get those. We get silence and repetition." He set the folder down. "I thought when I made it through that mission, it would all start to make sense. It won't. But you learn to live with the questions. And if you're lucky, you learn to lead without needing all the answers." They sat in silence for a while, the ceiling fan creaking overhead. The weight between them wasn't tension anymore. It was understanding. Then Maya spoke, almost too quietly to hear. "Park's going to make it. Surgery went well. He's not coming back to the field, but he's alive." Hoffman exhaled, a breath he didn't know he was holding. "You saved him," she added. "Your fire kept that sniper pinned long enough for me to flank." He looked at her. "You never said that before." "Didn't have to." He nodded. Then after a beat, "Do you ever think about what you'd be doing if you hadn't enlisted?" She smirked. "I'd probably be teaching middle school history in Oregon, but I'd be bored out of my mind. I used to think I'd coach football, Nebraska State, but now I don't know." "That's okay," she said. "Some of us don't find purpose until we lose something first." The lights dimmed automatically as curfew hit. Maya stood. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's a live fire scenario, and I expect your team to be tight." As she left, Hoffman remained seated, the after-action report still open in front of him. He wasn't searching for meaning anymore. He was remembering. And he knew now, remembering was part of the job too, especially for the ones who made it back. The summer heat gave way to the first hints of fall. Morning drills were cooler now, breath visible during warm-ups. Fort Bragg began its seasonal shift. Less dust, more wind, leaves crackling under boots during perimeter runs. Maya stood on the observation platform above the course, clipboard in hand. Below, Hoffman led a squad through a hostage extraction simulation. His voice carried clearly. Steady, direct, not loud, but impossible to ignore. You move on me, not before. Watch your angles. Remember what happens if you breach too soon. The squad advanced, sweeping the mock urban grid. Smoke canisters curled through the air. One recruit tripped on a corner. Hoffman reached down without breaking stride and yanked him up. When the drill ended, Maya climbed down. Timing was tight, good control. Hoffman gave a short nod. Still too much chatter on comms. I'll run it again tonight. You catching yourself using my phrases yet? Only the good ones. That night, Maya sat in the staff office, reviewing paperwork for her next assignment. Syria had changed things. Command wanted her in intel support. Less field time, more coordination. It didn't sit right. She wasn't ready to be the one sending people into the fire while she stayed behind a desk. A knock at the door. Hoffman entered, holding a small envelope. Mail. Thought you'd want to see this. Inside was a photograph. Park standing in front of a rehab center, smiling awkwardly, his daughter perched on his shoulders. Maya stared at the image for a long time. He looks older. He looks alive, Hoffman said. She set the photo down. You ready for selection? I think so. That's not the same as being ready. He met her gaze. I don't know if I'll pass, but I'm not afraid of the failure anymore. I've failed before. That's where I figured out who I am. She leaned back, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. You're not who you were when you got here, not even close. He hesitated, then said, You ever think you'd be a teacher? Maya smiled. No, but life has a way of drafting us into roles we never auditioned for. The wind outside picked up. Leaves scraped along the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a bugle sounded taps. I don't know what happens after selection, Hoffman said. But whatever it is, I'm ready to carry it. The weight, I mean. Maya nodded. Yeah. Good, because it only gets heavier from here. They sat in silence for a few minutes, no rank, no role. Just two soldiers bound by something deeper than the uniform. As Hoffman stood to leave, she said, Pack light, but take that photo with you. Park earned that moment, and so did you. He paused. You ever going back into the field? She didn't answer right away. Not sure yet, but I'll know when it's time. He gave a small, respectful nod, then stepped out into the dark hallway. Maya looked back down at the photograph, the edges curling slightly. There were victories in this job, quiet ones, hard-won and rarely recognized, and sometimes they came in the form of a soldier who finally understood the difference between being strong and being worthy. The morning of Hoffman's departure came with overcast skies and the muted stillness that always seemed to accompany major change. The transport bus idled near the barracks, its diesel hum low and constant. Maya stood near the flagpole, arms crossed, watching Hoffman double-check his duffel. He moved differently now, efficient, quiet, present, no wasted motion, no false confidence. She approached him as he tightened the last strap. Selection's going to break you in ways you haven't imagined, she said. That's the point. He gave a short nod. I know. You won't sleep. You'll hallucinate. You'll fail more times than you'll succeed, but they're not looking for perfect. They're looking for honest. He met her eyes. And if I don't make it, she shrugged, then you learn from that too, and you lead somewhere else, because you're already a soldier. The tab just changes your title, not your worth. Other recruits were already on the bus, some joking to hide their nerves, others staring silently at the horizon. Hoffman turned to board, then paused. When I get back, if I get back, will you still be here? Maya hesitated. Maybe. There's talk of reassignment. DC wants me behind a desk, strategy and operations. He frowned. You okay with that? Doesn't matter. It's where they think I'm needed. He didn't argue, just nodded, then stepped onto the bus. Maya stood there as the doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, the exhaust trailing behind like fog. Later that day, she sat in her quarters, packing away years of field notes, deployment logs, and worn gear. Each item held weight. not just in pounds, but in memory. In kid, there was a knock. Captain Mason entered, holding a file. "It's official," he said. "They want you in Arlington. War College liaison. Desk job. It's more than that. You'll shape doctrine. Train the next generation from the top down." She looked at the file. And Hoffman? Already on the first phase of selection. Word is he passed the ruck with time to spare. Maya exhaled, a mix of pride and restraint. "You made a soldier out of him," Mason said. "No," she replied. "He made one out of himself. I just didn't let him quit." That night, she walked the perimeter one last time. Same route she'd taken since her first day back stateside. The pine trees rustled gently. The stars were faint, barely visible through the low cloud cover. Near the training field, she found herself standing where Hoffman had once aimed that training rifle at her head. It felt like a different life. She closed her eyes, let the wind move around her. Then she turned and walked back toward her quarters. No ceremony, no salute, just a quiet exit, the way soldiers preferred. Somewhere out there, a recruit was becoming something more. And somewhere deep inside, Maya Reeves knew her time in the field was over. But the fight to build better warriors, that was just beginning. Arlington in October was a study in contrasts. Crisp winds sweeping through rows of silent white headstones, fiery red leaves falling over marble paths. Maya adjusted to the rhythm slowly. The War College compound was polished and composed. Meetings at 0800, lectures on asymmetric warfare at 1400, policy briefings over black coffee that never stayed hot long enough. She wore dress blues more often than fatigues now. But some habits never changed. Boots always polished, bed always tight, voice always calm. In a quiet corner office with a view of the cemetery lawn, she reviewed after-action reports from global deployments. She saw echoes of herself in every marginal note. Flanking decisions, calls made under fire, the weight of leadership scribbled between redacted lines. Then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside, a folded piece of paper and a photograph. In the photo, a squad stood together in front of a weathered sign marked Camp McCall. They were fresh from Special Forces selection, faces dirty, eyes tired, backs straight. Front and center, Hoffman. Tab on his shoulder, smile ghosting across his face. The note read, "You once told me the field doesn't wait for us to be ready. You were right. But now I know when to move and when to stay still. See you in the fight. JQ." Maya leaned back in her chair, the corners of her mouth tugging upward just slightly. For a long moment, she said nothing. That evening, she visited Section 60. No ceremony, just presence. She knelt beside an old friend's headstone, ran her fingers across the carved name. "You'd have liked him," she whispered. Leaves danced across the stone. She didn't stay long, she never did. Back in her office, she pinned the photograph to the inside of her locker door, not for others to see, just for her. The next day, she led a seminar titled The Cost of Command. Room full of officers, some younger than she'd been when it all started. She opened with a simple sentence. "There's no such thing as fearless. There's only the people who keep moving anyway." The room fell quiet. Her voice stayed steady. And somewhere in the Syrian desert or the hills of some place not yet on the map, she knew a soldier named Hoffman was putting those words into action. No more questions. No more hesitation, just the weight and the will to carry it. Winter crept over Virginia with slow, deliberate grace. Maya fell into the rhythms of life at Arlington, lectures, consultations, and long walks through the corridors of strategy and memory. But a part of her still listened for distant echoes, radio chatter in foreign languages, the muted thump of boots in sand. Her office was always quiet before sunrise. She liked it that way. It gave her time to think. One morning, as she reviewed a briefing on Eastern European force deployments, a knock interrupted the silence. Captain Mason stepped in, his presence unchanged by the polished surroundings. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, placing a secure folder on her desk. She opened it. Photos, satellite captures, aerial heat maps. At the center, an image of Hoffman, bearded now, leaner, face partially obscured by goggles and dust, but unmistakable. "Recon in the Caucasus, unofficial. He's attached to a unit technically not supposed to exist," Mason said. Maya closed the folder slowly. And yet they sent you here with this. They know who trained him. They think you can decode the way he thinks. He thinks like someone who understands loss, she said, and someone who's not afraid of it anymore. Mason studied her. He's grown into something real. You were right about him. She said nothing, just nodded. Later that week, Maya attended a closed-door session with Pentagon analysts. They discussed drone corridors, economic sanctions, counterinsurgency failures, and buried in the slides, brief mention of a village extraction conducted with zero casualties, high-value targets recovered, team exfiltrated undetected, unofficial, but her gut knew the signature. Hoffman. That night, as snow began to fall, Maya returned to her apartment just outside the gates. She made tea, took off her boots, and sat by the window. In her hand, she held a photo, faded at the corners, of her first team taken years ago in Kandahar. 4 of them were gone now. She stared at their faces, then at Hoffman's note still folded on her desk. She thought about what it meant to pass something on. Not rank, not tradition, but responsibility. The next morning, she stood before a new group of officers beginning their leadership track. Some wore stars already. Others had never fired their weapon outside a range. She looked at them and said, I trained a man who once pointed a rifle at my head, and I trusted him to save lives, not because he was ready, but because he refused to stay who he was. A beat of silence. Leadership isn't about rank. It's about knowing when to step forward and when to carry someone else until they can walk beside you. The room remained quiet. She continued, and somewhere overseas, Hoffman led a team through snow-covered hills under foreign stars, his voice in their ears steady, calm, never loud. They didn't know her name, but they moved like men trained by someone who understood the cost of every step. Maya's final week at Arlington came without much ceremony. She declined the luncheon, avoided the speeches, and turned down the commemorative plaque someone in admin thought she'd appreciate. Instead, she boxed up her office in silence, stacking years of reports, notebooks, and field maps with methodical care. She left the photograph of Hoffman pinned inside the locker. Her orders were clear. A return to Fort Bragg to oversee a specialized field readiness unit. Not combat, not exactly, but close enough to feel the dirt under her boots again. That morning, she stood at the edge of the parade field, her bag at her feet, waiting for the transport. Her breath hung in the air, mingling with the frost curling along the flagpole. Captain Mason joined her. You're really doing it. The desk was useful, but it's not where I do my best work. He handed her a sealed envelope. Classified. Hoffman's unit made contact last week. Successful extraction, 3 American assets saved. Minimal resistance. She opened it. Inside was a single page. No names, no locations, just a handwritten sentence. Learn from the best. Still carrying the weight. J.H. She folded the paper and tucked it into her jacket. You two will cross paths again, Mason. A&M. Bye, Mason said. Maybe, maybe not. That's not the point. Then what is? She turned toward the rising sun, that he carries it now without needing to ask how. The Humvee arrived. She climbed in without a word. Back at Fort Bragg, things had changed. New faces, new tech, but the air still smelled like red clay and pine. Her new unit was green, candidates prepping for embedded field roles. Some from intelligence, others from logistics or engineering. Not fighters, not yet, but they would be. In her first session, she walked the length of the room in silence. Recruits sat upright, unsure whether to speak. Then she said, I trained men and women who thought they'd never hold a weapon in real combat. Most of them made it. A few didn't, but all of them mattered. She stopped in front of a young officer, nervous, shoulders stiff. You think this job is about orders and chain of command. It's not. It's about knowing who you are when no one else is watching. No one moved. Some of you will be placed in situations you aren't ready for. You'll be afraid. You'll doubt. And when that moment comes, because it will, I need you to remember something. She paused. The air in the room tightened. It's not about being the strongest. It's about being the one who doesn't walk away. The silence held. Afterward, as the class filed out, one recruit lingered. Mama, he said, was it true that a recruit once pointed a rifle at you during training? Maya stared at him. Yes. What happened to him? She didn't answer right away, then softly, he became a leader. The recruit nodded, his face thoughtful. When he left, Maya turned back to the training field. Recruits ran in formation under the pale winter sun, and somewhere far away, under an entirely different sky, a man named Hoffman checked his gear, counted his team, and stepped forward into danger without hesitation, because now he was the one others followed. The calendar turned to spring, but Fort Bragg still felt like winter at dawn. Cold steel bleachers, frost-laced wind, and drill calls echoing across the fields. Maya stood at the edge of a new training cycle. Different faces, same questions, same weight. The unit she led had begun to earn a nickname, the last line. Not because they were elite yet, but because Maya trained them like every mission was their last chance to get it right. Late one evening, she received a secured message via base dispatch. No subject, no sender. Inside, a short video clip, grainy footage from a helmet cam, a snowy ravine, fast breath in the mic, and the sound of distant fire. Then, Hoffman's voice. Cover left. Doc, you're with me. Jones, hold position. A flash of movement, an extraction under fire. No theatrics, just precision. Resolve. The clip ended with a blurred frame of Hoffman turning back for one last man before disappearing into the trees. Attached to the file was a single line of typed text. He leads now like someone who knows what it costs to be led. Maya sat with that for a long time. The desk lamp hummed. Outside, the trees whispered in the dark. The next day, during live fire movement drills, one recruit froze during a breach simulation. Maya didn't shout. She walked up, took the weapon gently, and looked him in the eye. You're not failing because you're scared. You're failing because you think no one else is. She handed the rifle back. We all hesitate. It's what you do next that defines you. Reset the scenario. The team ran it again. The recruit moved, not perfect, but forward. That night, Maya updated her logs. Under one trainee's file, she wrote, froze once, corrected, still willing to try, potential to carry others. Weeks later, as Maya stood at the end of the qualification range, she received another dispatch. This time, a handwritten letter folded inside a sealed pouch. We lost someone yesterday, young, too eager. I tried to warn him. He didn't listen. I did everything you taught me. I stayed calm. I finished the mission. But I felt it, the cost. You told me once that every step out here leaves a mark. I understand now, not because I fell, but because someone else did. I just wanted you to know I carry the weight, still, always. J.H. She folded the letter, placed it in the inside pocket of her uniform. Later that evening, during the final field exercise of the quarter, she stood by the tower and watched her trainees advance through fog terrain. One of them, a smaller soldier with a quiet presence, moved to cover a teammate who'd slipped. No orders, just instinct. Maya smiled slightly. There it was again. The slow fire passed from one to another. The weight shared. And somewhere thousands of miles away, James Hoffman was proving that legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn every time you refuse to let the silence swallow what must be carried forward. May rolled in with thick southern storms. Rain hammered Fort Bragg's rooftops, and thunder cracked like distant artillery. But inside the training compound, the drills continued. Maya had taught in worse. The new recruits were sharper now. Tighter formations, cleaner corners, steadier voices under pressure. Maya rarely needed to shout. Her presence alone moved them. On a Tuesday morning just before sunrise, Captain Mason showed up unannounced, rain dripping from his field jacket. He held a plain manila folder. No seal, no rank. You need to see this, he said. Inside the folder, a reconnaissance transcript, coded but readable. A village near the Tigris River. Extraction gone sideways. One operator led the fallback, held the line, stayed behind long enough to allow the others to escape. Minimal casualties. Mission classified as success. Mason tapped a line on the final page. Operative H accounted for. Status, unknown. Last seen engaging hostiles to protect egress path. Maya felt something inside her lock into place. How long ago? 12 hours. No further updates yet. She didn't speak, just stared at the words. Later, during drills, her voice was sharper. Every command clipped. She paced more than usual, arms crossed, boots heavy. That evening, alone in the briefing room, she sat in the dark, watching an old playback of Hoffman leading a simulated exercise. His voice steady, his presence centered. She remembered his first day, the smirk, the rifle, the moment he made the worst mistake of his life, and everything that came after. Hours passed, then, just before midnight, a message came through her secure terminal. Confirmed, Operative Hoffman exfiltrated with final team. Minor injuries. Currently en route to Ramstein. Full report to follow. No emotion in the wording, just facts. But Maya closed her eyes, leaned back, and let the breath out slowly. She didn't smile. That wasn't how it worked. But she whispered to no one, "Good." The next morning, as the sun broke through the thinning storm clouds, Maya stood before her trainees again. She looked across the field and said, "The world won't remember your drills. It won't care how many reps you did or how many times you fired a clean shot in training. What it remembers, if you're lucky, is the one moment you refused to back down. The day you chose someone else's life over your own comfort." They stood still, silent. "If you're not training for that moment, then you're not training at all." She turned and walked the perimeter as they began again. Her posture unchanged, her presence steady. And far across the ocean, a soldier sat in a recovery room, stitches across his forearm, watching the ceiling fans spin in lazy circles. He reached into his bag and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside it, a note from Maya, written long ago. "When it gets heavy, remember, real strength isn't loud, it carries quietly." He read it once more, then placed it back where it belonged, and exhaled. Ramstein Air Base was cold and efficient. Fluorescent lights, polished tile floors, nurses in constant motion. Hoffman sat upright on the hospital cot, arm bandaged, ribs wrapped, face blank. Outside the window, the German sky was gray, quiet. A young lieutenant entered, holding a tablet. "Message for you, sir, direct from Fort Bragg." Hoffman took it. On screen was a video, static first, then Maya. She stood in front of a formation at Bragg, field jacket zipped, wind flattening her hair. "Private James Hoffman, you once aimed a rifle at me to prove you didn't need to listen. You've spent every day since proving that you were willing to learn." Her voice didn't waver. "What you did out there, staying behind, holding the corridor for your team, that's not just courage, that's legacy. You carried them because you understood what was at stake. That's all we ever ask of a soldier." She stepped aside. Behind her, a new wave of recruits stood at attention. "They don't know your name yet, but they will, because I'm telling them. And the next time someone freezes, I'll remind them that the man who once got it all wrong became the one who got it right when it counted." The video cut out. Hoffman stared at the blank screen, then set the tablet down. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. But something inside him settled. That evening, as the snow began to fall, he sat by the window with a cup of black coffee. Across the room, another soldier stirred in sleep. Machines beeped low. Hoffman opened his notebook. He hadn't written since selection. But now he began. "Some lessons cost everything. Others only cost your pride. But the ones that stay with you, those are the ones someone else paid for. So you get to keep learning." He paused, then continued. "I thought carrying the weight meant suffering. But now I know it means remembering, and refusing to let the memory become an excuse not to act." He closed the book. The next morning, he limped down to the recovery gym, pulled the resistance bands, worked the scar tissue, felt the ache. In Fort Bragg, Maya stood before a new unit, her posture unchanged, no hesitation in her words. "We don't get to choose our first failure, but we get to choose what comes next." And some of the best soldiers I've ever known, they came back stronger, not in spite of the pain, but because of it. She paused, then added, "One of them is out there right now, recovering. And when he returns, you'll see what it looks like to lead without needing to be loud." She walked off the platform as the recruits stood still, unsure whether they just heard a warning or a promise. Somewhere across oceans and scars and all the moments that change people, James Hoffman was becoming the soldier others could lean on. And Maya Reeves had become the voice in his head, the one that kept him steady when everything else fell silent. Summer returned to Fort Bragg in heat waves and fireflies. The field hummed with life, recruits shouting cadence, boots pounding gravel, instructors barking drills into dust-thick air. At the edge of the training grounds, Maya stood quietly, clipboard tucked under one arm, eyes tracking every motion. She didn't speak often anymore. She didn't have to. Her presence alone shaped the atmosphere. The command center buzzed with talk that day. A familiar name had resurfaced in personnel logs. James Hoffman, reassigned, cleared for duty. He arrived at dusk. No ceremony, just a duffel over his shoulder, paperwork in hand. His uniform fit tighter around broader shoulders. There were new lines around his eyes. Not age, experience. Maya waited for him near the barracks. He stopped a few paces away, dropped the duffel, and saluted. "Reporting for assignment, Sergeant." She didn't salute back. She stepped forward, extended her hand. "Welcome home, James." He shook it. Firm, no performance. Later, they walked the perimeter trail in silence, as they had years ago, but this time side by side. Not instructor and student, not veteran and recruit, equals. "They want me on advisory for the next readiness group," Hoffman said. "Said I've seen enough to help shape them." "You have? You okay not being in the field anymore?" Maya looked up at the stars. "I've led enough. Now I build the ones who'll lead after me." They stopped near the training tower. Below, a squad moved through the shadows, clearing corners. A voice cracked over comms, hesitant, learning. Hoffman watched. "They have no idea what's coming." "They will, and they'll survive it, because someone will make sure they do." "You mean us?" She looked at him. "I mean you." The air was warm and still. The base lights flickered to life. Somewhere across the yard, recruits shouted in unison, voices not yet broken by experience, but already shaped by it. Maya turned to him. "What do you want them to learn first?" He considered it. That failure's not the end. That sometimes being knocked down is the only way to figure out who you are when you stand back up. She nodded. They walked on. As they passed the main training gate, a few recruits stood at attention, watching them with quiet curiosity. They didn't know the full story, not yet, but they'd heard whispers. The recruit who once aimed his rifle at a veteran and became one himself. The woman who saw the threat, and instead of shutting him down, forged him into steel. Back in her quarters, Maya placed a final note into a box she kept locked. It read, "He carries the weight now, and he teaches others how." She sealed it. The screen faded to black. Then the final line appeared. "Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share the video."